Yesterday, Republican Senator Ben Sasse spoke about his Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. The legislation would prohibit a healthcare practitioner from failing to exercise proper care in the case of a baby who survives an abortion or attempted abortion. The senator introduced this bill in reaction to recent remarks by Virginia Democratic Governor Ralph Northam on late-term abortions. Senators Joni Ernst, Josh Hawley, James Lankford, and Mike Braun also joined the debate.
Mr. President, thank you. In a few minutes, the United States Senate is going to have an opportunity to condemn infanticide. 100 United States senators are going to have an opportunity to unanimously say the most basic thing imaginable, and that is that it's wrong to kill a little newborn baby. Every senator will have the opportunity to stand for human dignity, to stand for the belief that in this country, all of us are created equal. Because if that equality means anything, surely it means that infanticide is wrong. Frankly, this shouldn't be hard. Politicians come to this floor every single day and talk about how they care for the poorest or the weakest or the most marginalized members of our society. In recent weeks, I've heard it stated this way, in powerful, eloquent, and from some ambitious senators, very clear terms about human dignity. One of my distinguished colleagues recently on the campaign trail declared rightly that, quote, the people in our society who are the most often targeted by predators are also most often the voiceless and the vulnerable, close quote. Amen to that. Another Democratic senator seeking the presidency said, quote, they seek to build a country where no one is forgotten and no one is left behind. Amen to that. Giving words of hope and encouragement, a third senator reminded us that, quote, no matter where you live in America, you deserve a path to opportunity, close quote. Amen to that. A fourth continued that this individual was committed to, quote, fight for other people's kids as hard as they would fight for their own, close quote. And yet again, amen. But sadly, in the last week, these beautiful and inspiring words have been choked out by the ugliness and the cruelty from another public official. In Virginia, disgraced Governor Ralph Northam tarnished the American idea of equality under law. He betrayed the universal truth of human dignity, and he turned the stomachs of civilized people, not just in this country, but in every country on earth. Governor Northam endorsed infanticide. Quote, here's what he said. Quote, the infant would be kept comfortable, the infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired, and then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and the mother, close quote. This was the quote, that the infant would be kept comfortable and resuscitated if that's what the mom and the doctors wanted to do, and then they could have a debate about what to do next. He was literally talking about allowing space and time for a discussion of infanticide. No euphemisms, no weasel words there. Infants could be kept comfortable and resuscitated, and also baby girls could be left cold and alone to die. Just a few years ago, the abortion lobby was really clear in its talk about hoping that abortion would be safe and legal, but rare. This was the slogan. Abortion would be safe, legal, and rare. Now we're talking about keeping a baby comfortable while the doctors have a debate about infanticide. That is what we're talking about here on the floor tonight. We're not talking about second trimester abortion. We're not having some big complicated discussion about a mother's reproductive freedom, as important as all those debates are. We are actually talking about babies that have been born. The only debate on the floor tonight is about infanticide. The abortion industry's PR army couldn't defend this. Many in the national media decided to try to overlook it, but none of us in this body can escape it. What we're talking about on the Senate floor tonight is infanticide. And instead of saying he misspoke, instead of offering an apology, the governor of Virginia decided to double down on the ugliness and the cruelty. This isn't about a clump of cells. This is about fourth trimester abortion. That's actually what we're talking about here tonight. Governor Northam is a disgraced coward, and he has such an abysmally low view of human dignity that he couldn't bring himself to say this basic truth. It's wrong to let little babies who've been born die. He couldn't say it. This isn't about Republicans and Democrats. We're way beyond that. Everyone in this Senate ought to be able to say unequivocally that the little baby deserves life, that she has rights, and that killing her is wrong. And tonight, every member of this body has that chance. The Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act prohibits exactly the kind of infanticide that Governor Northam was endorsing. That's it. That's what the legislation is about. It's based on the simple idea that every baby deserves a fighting chance. It's a simple idea that every human being is an image bearer. Even the weakest and the most marginalized among us are no less human, and every one of us has a moral obligation to defend the defenseless. It's my understanding that some of my Democratic colleagues are prepared to object tonight. I humbly say that I don't understand why, and I beg you from the bottom of my heart not to do so. Please don't betray the ideals that have been so eloquently expressed. Please don't reduce truths to an empty campaign slogan, and please don't take the principle of dignity and equality this cheaply. There are only two sides of the debate on the floor tonight. You're either for babies or you're defending infanticide. That is actually what the legislation is that's before us. Please don't block this legislation. Please don't let Governor Northam define you. Don't let an extremist pro-abortion lobby and pledge hold you hostage. Please don't protect infanticide. And so, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on the Judiciary would be discharged from further consideration of S-130 and that the Senate would proceed to the immediate consideration of that. I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read for a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, we have laws against infanticide in this country. This is a gross misinterpretation of the actual language of the bill that is being asked to be considered, and therefore I object.
Objection is heard.
With all due respect, Mr. President.
Senator from Nebraska.
To the senator from Washington, the bill that we're talking about before this body tonight is because New York and Virginia, New York already, and Virginia in debate are having a conversation about removing exactly these protections. This debate is about infanticide and infanticide only, and this is a sad day for this body. It shouldn't be controversial to say that a newborn child deserves to be treated with dignity and humanity. It shouldn't be difficult to say that babies who survive an abortion shouldn't be left to die cold and alone on that table. I'm sad, but I'm not discouraged, Mr. President. I'm actually encouraged by the strong group of senators who've co-sponsored this legislation and who have come to the floor to support it tonight. And I'm encouraged by the millions and millions and millions of pro-life Americans who continue to speak the truth in love. There's legislative work that we need to do, but far more importantly, in the movement for love and life and science and little babies, what we need to have happen is a lot more persuasion and a lot more conversation with our neighbors, and a number of my colleagues on the floor tonight are prepared to do just that, and I look forward to listening to their eloquent and love-based, science-based speech. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, I rise today very, very disheartened, and I do want to thank the junior senator from Nebraska for having this very difficult discussion on the floor of the Senate. As you were speaking, colleague from Nebraska, I have a tightness in my chest. I'm a mom. I've been through childbirth. And I can't imagine anyone taking my child, setting her aside, and then having a discussion on whether she should live or die. I can't imagine that. Can't imagine after having such a precious thing as a child brought into the world, and then have these odious discussions of whether she should live. I can't imagine putting a baby through that. So I am disheartened, and I'm absolutely appalled by the debate that we have had in front of us, a debate I would have once considered unfathomable on the floor of the United States Senate. Many have often referred to this as the world's greatest deliberative body. But let me be clear, folks, there is nothing great, there is nothing moral or even humane about the discussion that we have before us today. Over the past week, we have witnessed the absolutely ugly truth about the far-reaching grasp of the abortion industry and its increasingly radicalized political agenda. Politicians have not only defended aborting a child while a woman is in labor, but have gone so far as to support the termination of a child after his or her birth. A child, a baby. Rationality, decency, and basic human compassion have fallen by the wayside. Somehow this conversation has devolved so completely that a bill prohibiting the murder of children who are born alive, a bill that simply prohibits infanticide, has tonight been blocked on the floor of the Senate. We have moved beyond all common sense when this body can no longer unanimously condemn murder. We face a moral crisis when this body refuses to acknowledge the repugnancy and savagery of infanticide. This assault on human dignity cannot stand. I urge my colleagues to set aside their partisanship and instead defend the most basic values of compassion and decency that should define our society. We can and we must do better, folks. Again, I thank the junior senator from the great state of Nebraska for his leadership on this issue. And I call on my colleagues to bring this common sense legislation to the Senate floor for a vote. I also implore my colleagues. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I rise in support of Senate Bill 130, which I am proud to co-sponsor. This legislation would ensure that healthcare providers treat babies born alive after failed abortion attempts with the same care they would treat any other baby born at the same stage of pregnancy. And I also want to thank the senator from Nebraska for his leadership on this issue and for bringing this issue to the floor. You know, in one sense, it's very hard to imagine that this legislation is even necessary. In the United States of America, in the 21st century, when every day new advanced technologies bring new revelations about the wonders of human life, it is hard to fathom the extremism, the politicians in New York and now Virginia who would deny the protections of law to the most vulnerable members of our society, the innocent unborn, and allow them to be aborted, allow them to be killed right up to the moment of birth. It is hard to comprehend statements like those of Virginia Governor Ralph Northam, who said that if he had his way, infants who survived abortion attempts would be delivered and kept comfortable, that's his phrase, kept comfortable, while the doctor and the parents decided her fate. Is this really what it has come to in the United States? Is this really the social vision of today's Democrat Party? Because frankly, I can't imagine a vision less just or less consistent with the goodness and compassion of the American people. But in another sense, Mr. President, perhaps we should not be so surprised. After all, the cruelty and extremism advocated by a growing number of Democrat politicians was the conventional wisdom for much of recorded history. We often hail the ancient Greeks as the founders of democracy, but of course, most of the Greeks believed that most humans were born to be slaves and that their lives were utterly worthless. Oh, they had a democracy, of course, but it was the democracy of the few ruling over the many. Romans took the same view. They kept most of their subjects in chains. They infamously killed children they didn't want, leaving them to be exposed on hillsides or desert places. Romans had a republic, but citizenship was for the few. The strong ruled. Most lives, they thought, didn't matter. This has been the general rule of the ages. The Aztecs, Maya, Inca, all practiced child sacrifice. Archaeologists recently discovered a burial ground dated to the Chimu Empire in Peru where more than 140 children were dismembered in a ritual of sacrifice. And so it has gone down through the years. The strong prey upon the weak, the few rule the many. Individual lives don't count. But Mr. President, we here in the United States of America hold to a different conviction. Our Constitution was written. The whole edifice of American liberty depends on a very different belief, a belief as simple as it is powerful, that every life matters. We believe, and it is our pride to believe, that every person has dignity and worth that is not given to them by the strong or the rich, that does not come to them from the state or the city, that does not depend on place of birth or social status, but is theirs by right because of who they are. Human beings created in the image of the living God. That is our faith. And against the drift of history, it is a revolutionary creed. It is a creed that inspired the early Christians to rescue those infants the Romans left to die and bring them up to be free. It led them to found hospitals and schools and later universities on the supposition that all people should be cared for, that all can learn, that all can govern themselves. It is a creed that has brought down empires and raised up the forgotten. It is the faith of our Constitution and of our whole way of life. And yes, we have struggled to realize it in this nation. We have struggled to make it real. We have fallen short many times. But this struggle for this faith defines our history and binds us together as Americans. And this faith is again at issue in our time. Now, I know some are tempted when they see this rising tide of barbarism and cruelty to feel despair. But I am not. I think of the words of Lincoln, who spoke of the unfinished work of this nation. And I take courage that all these years later, we are a revolutionary nation still. So we must press forward in this generation for our revolutionary faith. Let us not go back to the darkness and cruelty of the past. Let us not go back to the arbitrary rule of the powerful and the few. Let us affirm again our founding belief in the equal worth and equal dignity of all. And as we do, Mr. President, we will do our part for liberty and justice in our day. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
The Senate often does things by unanimous consent, areas where there's really no common disagreement. This body will do a unanimous consent to congratulate the New England Patriots for winning the Super Bowl. And unanimously, all of us will agree to congratulate them. But today, the senator from Nebraska brought up a very straightforward, simple bill. Do we, as a nation, permit infanticide? For some reason, the New England Patriots is non-controversial, but the death of children at their delivery is controversial enough that my Democratic colleagues are blocking it. Now, it's not some fancy formal bill with a trick piece into it. It's a very simple, straightforward bill. Occasionally, an abortion is botched, and while they're actually trying to take the life of a child, the child is actually delivered. At that moment, the child is delivered and is on the table crying, and the question is, now what do we do? Current medical practice is back away from the child and allow them to die slowly on the table because they were supposed to have been an abortion. Though the child was fully delivered, and is on the table, umbilical cord attached, crying. This doesn't seem like this should be controversial. This seems like this should be as straightforward as congratulating the Patriots for winning the Super Bowl. How can we as Americans say no to a fully delivered child's life? The question about abortion has been historically a question about when does life begin. I'm one of those crazy radicals that actually believes in science. And I think when cell division is occurring and DNA is there that's different than the mom and different than the dad, that's actually a different human being. A smaller human being, but a different human being. That's what everyone in science believes. That child that's developing is alive. Their day of their birth is just another day. Now, it's a pretty traumatic day for them to be able to transition from in the womb to outside, but birth is just another day in life for that child because they're fully developing. They were developing in the womb, they're developing outside the womb. Every single person that can hear this has had the exact same experience of developing in the womb. This seemed like this was a common sense issue until the state of New York a few weeks ago stood and cheered and applauded when they passed a bill for third trimester abortions. This is ultra late term abortions. This is a fully viable child abortions. Now, let me just review real quick on what the state of New York did. There are only 4 countries in the world that allow late term abortions. Only 4 left. North Korea, China, Vietnam, and the United States. And New York legislature stood and cheered that they're in the middle of the human rights depraved nations of China, North Korea, and Vietnam. That's at 24 weeks and on. At 20 weeks, there's still left Canada and the Netherlands and Singapore. But by 24 weeks, at that late term, Canada, the Netherlands, and Singapore, they drop off. They're like, no, we're out. That's a fully viable child. But New York legislature stood and applauded. And then it got one-upped in Virginia last week, as the governor of Virginia explained their late-term abortion bill as one-upping New York, saying in their bill, in his words, this is how it would work. If a child has deformities, however that's defined, or for the mental or physical health, however they want to define that, with any loose, because there was no definition, they would deliver the child, make them comfortable, resuscitate the child if the mother wanted, and then they would discuss what to do with the child. So it's not enough for the state of New York to applaud late-term abortions and joining North Korea, China, and Vietnam as the only place on earth that allows this. No, Virginia Democrats had to go one more and say, let's deliver the child and then discuss it based on their deformities. Back to the Super Bowl conversation, one of the most popular commercials in the Super Bowl was for a gaming system showing kids with disabilities playing a video game just like other kids. Except now they want to decide at that child's birth whether to just take that life then. How in the world can we as a culture run a television commercial and say, that kid is just like that kid? Look, they play games just alike. But when they're little, let's deliver them and discuss it and figure out what we want to do. This is infanticide. This is not about pro-life and pro-choice. This is pro-humanity. To get to the point that we're discussing whether a child lives or dies based on what they look like at birth. And if they don't quite look right, then we'll take that life, is inhumane and is beneath us as a